Hello, Rekindle friends. I am so glad to join you for this final week of Rekindle the Flame. I cannot say enough good things about the way that you have made it through this program. The joy that I have seen you participate and learn together in groups, and the amazing outpouring of knowledge that has been shared with you through my colleagues. I hope that it has been as wonderful an experience for you to experience the New Testament in this way, and has kind of whet your appetite for deeper study into the biblical text. But we aren't done quite yet. We have the last half of the book of Revelation to get through, so let's jump in. Last week, Carlene covered the genre of apocalyptic literature for you. The formats, the intention, the relevance to the community at the time it was written, and for us now. Now remember, this is a letter and a vision for people that are losing hope in the midst of persecution. And this is a universal loss of hope when societal action is no longer getting to the heart of things and making a change like it should. I believe that that's one of the reasons that we see the prevalence of dystopian literature and film in the world today. It's the same pattern that we see as hope begins to dwindle. Remember that we're not looking for the resolution to happen in our lifetime, but rather we are receiving a promise that it will happen, that God will ultimately triumph over all things, but especially evil. One final thing before we dive in is that in the midst of this message of hope and encouragement, we are looking at a lot of symbols. And what we're doing as a class together is not looking for them to be a guidebook, but we are looking to them to show us meaning behind the symbols. So it is hope in a specific form of literature. So let's jump into chapter 12. In chapters 12 through 14, we have 7 signs. Now there are 3 signs that occur in heaven and 4 on earth, but only one of them is good. This section really develops more fully the theme of persecution of God's people. Another way at looking at these visions that we have here is to make sure that we know that our view is not level, but we are looking at it from a heavenly perspective. So we're looking at it at like a 30,000 foot view. I know one of the main things that you're interested in these chapters is probably going to be the mark of the beast. Now I want to share with you a quick clip that popped up on YouTube when I was uploading Carlene's video last week. I think that it speaks to our interest in the mark of the beast really well. So let's jump into that.
A brief list of everything that Christians have thought was going to be the mark of the beast. This year, the popular theory is that the Palm payment program from Amazon's Whole Foods is going to be the way that the Antichrist from the Bible controls who can buy and sell things. But it wasn't too long ago that the leading candidate for the mark of the beast was Bitcoin and vaccine passports and RFID chips on cattle. In fact, if we go all the way back to the 1970s, when UPC codes were first starting to be used, there were a lot of pamphlets like this one that claimed that the mark of the beast will definitely be a barcode. But the decade before that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where a lot of people were sure they were living in the very end time. So you can imagine their horror when Visa and MasterCard were made available to the public. In the 1940s, it was social security numbers. And at first, this all seems to really devalue the Revelation story. But I think that's the mark of a capital T true story, is that every generation finds a way to see themselves in it.
I think that did a great way of showing its relevance to us throughout time, and we'll get to talk about it a little bit more here in a second. So in this chapter, we have the woman and the dragon, a cosmic woman who is in distress and gives birth to a messianic child who is threatened by the dragon, but is taken away to safety so that he can grow up to face the dragon later. Now the woman flees to a place of refuge, and that's when the beast comes into play. Now the beast had 7 heads and 7 horns, and remember, 7 is a perfect number. So what we have here with the beast is the fullness of evil, the perfection of evil made incarnate. And the beast assists the dragon, and we have the fun beginning of the mark of the beast. Now, its name is 666, and I say name because the numbers that we have here are the numerical values of the letters of a name. Of the many possibilities about who this could be referring to, the most likely is the Emperor Nero. Nero was the first emperor to inflict persecution against Christians in a real way. Now, John is writing while Domitian is emperor, But Domitian was said to be Nero back from the dead because he was so bad. His persecution was so intense that it echoed what Nero had done in the past. Now, there are two main reasons that John would use numbers instead of a direct name. Number one, John needed to protect himself. Well, it was clear enough to the readers at the time, and even to us, that this is about Rome. It had to be somewhat obscured for his safety. And number two, pharaohs and emperors come in many forms. The struggles of distressed Christians can come in many forms and through many ages of the world. And much like Pharaoh in the Old Testament, not being named for this reason, I believe that this is we don't have the name for the beast so that it can be translatable into many eras of the world. But much like pharaohs and emperors, they do not reign forever. And this is another part of the promise that God will conquer all. I think that as you're reading this, you're going to find that there are a lot of parallels and even direct reflections back to the Exodus story. So think in your mind, when you're reading this, maybe think Babylon in Revelation is Egypt to Exodus, and emperors and kings are pharaohs in Exodus. Really, all of which just represent oppressive systems that we could name in each age. So when we look at chapter 13, we can really see this theme of empire coming into play with the first beast listed. Now look at verse 6 and on. It opens its mouth to blaspheme God's name and God's dwelling and those therein, and it was allowed to make war on the saints and conquer them. I love verse 10, though. Here is a call for endurance and faith to the saints. Remember, this is a call of hope in the face of societal action being effective, a hope for endurance, and God's triumph over evil. In chapter 14, our major takeaways can be the message of the three angels. Number one, first angel, fear God and give glory and worship to the Creator. Angel 2, Babylon has fallen. Now remember what Babylon represents. And then 3, God's wrath on those that worship the beast. Now, after these proclamations, there's another call for endurance in verse 12. Here is a call for endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. Another theme that you might see in chapter 14 is this idea of God reaping the harvest. And that's something that we've seen throughout the Gospels, right? Especially with Jesus. The harvest is plenty, but the reapers are few. And so a good harvest will be taken of the fruit of the earth, right? And then there will also be a bad harvest that might have looked good on the surface, but when you get down into it, it is not good. And God is the one that makes the decision about what is a good harvest and what is a bad harvest and who is included in which section. And personally, I'm so glad that I don't have to make that call. In chapter 15, we find the 7 last plagues, the beginning of this. We have the direct song from Moses, found from Exodus 15, verses 1 through 18. And this whole section gives us imagery going all the way back to Exodus, where we find instructions on the tent of meeting. So that's really what we're talking about here, is the same idea of the tent of meeting, the fixtures of the tent, including bowls and requirements to come into the presence of God. All of this would have been very familiar language to the readers. In fact, chapters 15 and 16 have the most Exodus references of the whole book. So as you're reading through that section, I bet that you'll see those and think, this seems kind of familiar. And it's because it is. In 16, we learn what each bowl contains. So we have the 7 bowls. Number 1, sores. Number 2, sea into blood, springs into blood, the sun burning, darkness, drought and the gathering of the beast people, and earthquakes and storms. Those kind of parallel the plagues of Egypt. So just play around with that in your mind. Go back to Exodus and read some if it tickles your fancy. But I think it's really interesting on how he plays that off of each other. In chapter 17, we love a good complete number, and that's number 7. And in chapter 17, we have 7 kings that are listed. Now, there's a lot of scholarly debate on which emperors were on this list, but they were all named for their Jewish and Christian persecution, which Carlene discussed last week, which kind of ushers in like the beginning of martyrdom in a real way. Now, here on your screen, on this side, over here, is our ways of counting Roman emperors signified in chapter 17. Now, my Bible had this in it, and this should be available to you via your group leader, or it's online under weekly questions. You can find this resource. I just thought it was interesting to see the way that our scholarship has changed and the ways that people look at the influence of different leaders that have made an impact to make it into the book of Revelation. So take a look at that on your own time. It's just kind of interesting to see. Chapter 18 gives us the sum of all the reactions to the fall of Babylon. So much of what we read in this poem of the downfall of Rome was adopted language from the prophet Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. Again, another reminder that this was written to a community that would have been very familiar with the cadence and the language used in this letter. It tells them specific things about who is in control when everything is spinning out of control for them personally. That they can look at these exilic texts, so texts that were written while they were headed into exile, warnings that, if they didn't change, things were going to go poorly. They can take those familiar passages where they saw the exile of people, the ways that they were taken out of the temple and then brought back into community where God's promise was kept. Think about how comforting hearing these words again would be, right? Knowing that even though things are not in control, that everything is broken around them, that they can hear the echo of the past where God did come through in the ways that God will come through again in the future. It's another part of the promise and the hope. In chapter 19, we go back to the throne room. John is instructed to write these words, to write the heavenly choruses of praise that you read at the beginning, and John's like, whoa, I can't do that. I'm just a servant who holds the testimony of Jesus. And the angel is like, yes, you can, and you will. And there are some interesting things about the heavenly scene. Now, this should remind us of the first vision found in chapter 1. But then there are different points where we get kind of glimpses into the heavenly throne room. And we get different levels of closeness with John. So previously, he had kind of been on the edge of heaven and on the edge of the throne room. So in chapter 4, he had seen the door standing open to heaven, but he hadn't walked into it. And in chapter 11, the temple was standing open. But now we are introduced with, I saw heaven standing open. And he is now prepared for the fullness of this revelation. I just think it's interesting how we continually walk up closer and closer to the throne. And at the end, we get right up close with the throne. We have this rather gruesome scene of the beast being defeated, and then the birds are called in to feast on the beast's flesh, which is pretty nasty. And the beast and the prophet are thrown into the lake of fire, and the armies are defeated. Another thing that is going on is we have the beginning of the 7 scenes of triumph. Again, we love our number 7. Scene 1 begins in chapter 19, verses 11 through 16, where we see the return of Christ. Now, this is important because we have lots of imagery of Christ, right? At the beginning, we definitely have Christ as the Lamb of God, the slain Lamb of God, particularly. But now we've taken on kind of the Christ as conqueror idea. The imagery of war and conquest is here, but it's also been transformed. And I think that's really important for us, that God can use the imagery that we hold, but also use it to God's purpose. So the bloody robes are bloody from Christ's own redemptive blood, not the enemy's. And his sword comes from his mouth because his word is so powerful that it both judges and redeems. I have the song that plays on repeat in my head when I read this section. It's called Soldier Poet King by the Oh Hellos. And I think it's this wonderful ending to the vision of Christ as conqueror, having it be on God's terms, based on God's actions, not to overtake an empire in the way that other people had hoped, while Christ was on earth, but in the timing, in the way that God foresees it. We also have scene 2 in chapter 19, and that's the last battle. And for John, this victory is one with like a mopping up exercise. The final scene is yet to come. We're not done yet. This is only scene 2, but there's no more like battle scenes. We walk into scene 3 at the beginning of chapter 20 with the binding of Satan. Now, the binding of Satan is an image of eschatological victory. Eschatological is the big theological term meaning our understanding of the last things, or regarding the resurrection of the dead and the second coming of Christ and a new heaven and a new earth, right? So our understanding of the end times. This is our doctrine of the end times, eschatological. Now, the beast and the serpent are locked in, and the throne is present, and those that had been beheaded on behalf of their faith are resurrected to worship again. It's just kind of odd but victorious way of thinking about victory and about the end. Scene 4 brings us to the 1,000-year reign. Now, this section to me really says that evil may be gone for a period, but it will resurface. Yet there is the promise of triumph again over evil. This is just another one of those super hopeful notes to those readers then and to us now, that evil might be conquered for a period of time, and it may return, and it probably will return. But we do have this wonderful promise that God is going to come, and God is going to make all things right. In scene 5, we have the defeat of Gog and Magog. Now, this is directly from Ezekiel. So if you're interested in more details about this, I encourage you to go back and read Ezekiel 38 through 39. This moment really is like evil being magnified to its fullest before it's destroyed forever. That's what's happening here. Just with, again, familiar language for the people. Scene 6, this is the last judgment. This is the ultimate courtroom scene where justice will finally prevail. And it's such a beautiful image for us. I'm excited to share it with you. In this section, really what we're going to see is God revealed in Christ as the final judge. Now, I want you to pause here for a moment. I want you to pause with your group. Hit the pause button. Because I want you to think on your own or as a group, after all of the study that we have done and the deep dives and the overview looks into the Gospels and the other books of the New Testament, what did you learn about God revealed through Christ? What did Christ tell you about the nature of God? So really take a second and talk about that as a group, or journal about it on your own. For me, the study has reminded me of the overwhelming love and grace that Christ extended to each person. And each person that Christ interacted with, and each group of people that Christ addressed. And I think we see that played out in this scene, right? In the 2 books that are present here. There are 2 books used in this judgment scene. One book represents human responsibility, so that people are judged by what they have done. Now, I don't believe that this is works righteousness, where only the works that you do make a difference for whether you get into heaven. That's not something that we believe as United Methodists, and it's not something that I think is being held up as the thing that John wants us to know. But I do think that we have a role to play in living out the love and the grace that was modeled by God through Christ. And we've had great times being able to see that throughout and see how the early church was able to move through understanding who Christ was and what that meant for the way that we act in the world. I hope that you've seen that as well. And then the second book that is here is the Book of Grace. I love that. A book of grace in which people are saved by what God has done. God's grace and human responsibility are not laid out in some logical way for us to understand here. We can't decide where the balance is of these two things, but John's picture here tells us that those are the decisive things for us in our relationship to the divine. So how we act out what we know to be true of Christ, and then how God acts out God's self, God's understanding of the world, God's interactions with the world and with humanity. I think those are really important things for us to understand. And I truly believe that God's grace is beyond anything that I could ever fathom. And I take so much comfort in that. I think this scene might be the most comforting part of the book, and I hope that that you feel that as well. Scene 7 is all of chapter 1 going into 21 into chapter 22, references to the Old Testament eschatological prophecies, especially around Isaiah and Ezekiel. Remember, eschatological meaning our understanding of the end. They abound in this section. There are so many, but there are also references to the New Testament, to the overcomers from Ephesus and Thessalonica and Philadelphia, and countless other references to the beginning of the Revelation book itself and to the 7 churches in Asia. There's just a lot of we've seen this theme of eschatology all the way through the New Testament, where Jesus proclaimed the fulfillment of all things, but where those references are eschatological in nature when they were written, right? This is the actual fulfillment of them, the final thing that is required, and we see that fulfillment here now. And that's kind of why those are used as something that's familiar, but also something that has meaning for the community. The new heaven and the new earth are words that we hear most often during funerals as a symbol and a promise of hope. And within chapter 21 is described the New Jerusalem, or heaven, as we often describe it. And it's here that we get our image of pearly gates and streets of gold. My favorite part, though, is the section about light. The people live only in light, which we know from John's other writing to be Jesus, God, the light of the world. I love that we hear this in our hymnody as a Methodist people. We're taught a lot of things through the songs that we sing as a community, and the hymn, I Want to Walk as a Child of the Light, describes this chapter perfectly. The chorus of the song goes, in him there is no darkness at all. The night and the day are both alike. The Lamb is the light of the city of God. Shine in my heart, Lord Jesus. I just think it's a perfect way to come to almost the conclusion of this book and this study, right? So we've arrived at the last chapter, chapter 22, and there are 3 major parts to the conclusion of this vision. Number 1, the confirmation of the genuineness of the prophecy. It's important that people know that this is a real thing, that John hasn't made it up. Number 2, the imminence of Jesus coming. They truly believed as a community that the end was coming soon, and it probably really did seem that way to this community because things were so terrible with the persecution that they endured. So it's important that you know that this is coming, and this could come anytime. And number 3, a warning against idolatry and an invitation to enter into the city of God. Now, the imagery that we get here is right at the throne. Remember, we've been traveling up to the heavenly courtroom, to the throne room, and we finally arrived there, and there is the water of life flowing from the throne, watering the tree of life, producing fruit, and its leaves are for the healing of a broken world. The epilogue is the best benediction that the study can give. The best call to discipleship for one another, the best call for a broken and a hurting world. And it says this, the Spirit says, come, let everyone who hears come. Let everyone who is thirsty come, and let anyone who wishes to take the water of life as a gift. John's vision here is the great eschatological promise, and it is still totally dependent on God to create it. But it has major implications for the life of the church in every age. In the age of John and in our age now, we have been given instructions on how to live through the actions of Christ, and we've been given encouragement to be sustained through the trials and the chances and the seeming absence, but the actual presence of God through all things. This is why I see the book of Revelation of St. John as something deeply hopeful and excuse me, and I hope that you will hold that hope as well as you go forward into the world. It has been an entire honor to journey with you through the New Testament. My prayer for you and for the community is that you have had a spark of God's love rekindled in your heart during this time, and that we can continue to tend that flame as a community. Go in peace.